Father, we come before you this evening asking for your guidance and your direction and your help. Father, we pray for each one that's here and thank you for their safe trip here, the ones that came from out of town, and pray for their safe return. Father, bless this organization, bless the ones that came here. Help us all to go out and make a difference in putting godly principles back in our country where they started out. Father, we ask these things in our precious name. We ask these. Amen. Amen.
So, Dr. Virginia Armstrong, you can come up now. One of your papers. Did everybody get one of these from Virginia? About
last time there was a handout, so it's making the rounds. I don't have one, but hold one up. You got Jennifer, if you would. PowerPoint on both sides. Some of you share, if you would. My printer, something always happens, and it's usually computers if it's something I'm doing. And so the printer was first running out of ink, and then it was running out of paper. And by that time, I said, well, we'll just double up, and we did last time. So anyway, I'm delighted to be back with some of you, and then to meet some of you for the first time. I'm a little bit curious, how many were here last time, which was the first time? Okay, well, great. Bless you, you deserve a Purple Heart. You didn't have to, because no grade depended on it. But anyway, I'm always struck when somebody, as Robin says, as Robin did a minute ago, about the importance of spiritual things in the battles that we fight. And of course, the fact that they are so often ignored. I have some folks here I want to introduce to you in just a minute, but I was telling them coming over just a few minutes ago, my husband and I got involved in this battle back in the early 80s when we knew right, which we said last time was neither new nor right because it had been around all the time, and of course it was right. But anyway, that's what they called us. And it was with Reagan's ascendancy to the presidency, and so we appeared on the scene. And so I was just fresh out of had finally survived the PhD, and so had my husband. So we were, I guess, bad at somebody and ready to go get something, and so we got involved. And we weren't mad, but we were grateful to have things behind. And so we got involved, and we found out very quickly how much it was a spiritual battle. And it has only gotten far, far worse. But even back then, the issue where we encountered spiritual warfare at the most heated level was way back in the early 80s was with what was called very simply then, and that's all it amounted to, was one issue, and that was homosexual rights. And now, of course, that's proliferated, and it is by far the most heated issue. And this afternoon, right after lunch, I was resting, putting things together, and I was telling my friends here that I have never, and I have felt demonic attacks, I felt demonic oppression. I have never felt the demonic attacks like I felt them coming up against me after lunch this afternoon. And I'm absolutely sure the reason is because we were coming here tonight, and a big focus of our discussion is what we are going to call the new sexualism. It's a lot bigger than simply homosexual rights. That elicits more of a hatred from Satan than any other issue we discussed, including abortion or whatever. So I'm just grateful we're here. Please pray us all the way home, because and afterwards. But that's the kind of attack that we have. And as I work with the National Legal Forum and my friends in that who are all over the nation, and I get together and discuss the stories that they have of the spiritual attacks that have been launched against them, some of them are pretty unbelievable. So it's ubiquitous. It's a widespread thing. It's universal. It's everywhere that he has any opportunity to attack. And so when that happened to me, sometimes cell phones are a good deal. And when that happened to me this afternoon, I have two groups. One is a group of closer friends, and then another that's a little farther out. And I just got on the text and I just sent out 2 texts and I said, demonic attack is terrible, please pray. And it wasn't very long before I could feel some of the pressure lift and some peace come in. So I cannot emphasize enough to you all 2 things that Robin has hit both of them. Number 1 is pray. And there was, when I was living in Fort Worth, Dallas for a very brief time, which was still too long. But anyway, I got back to West Texas as fast as I could. God puts us in strange places sometimes. There was a little Baptist church down the road whose pastor's name was Armstrong. And he was a younger fellow, and he had a billboard, and it said, politics begins with prayer. And that was exactly right. And the other thing that she said that I heartily applaud, and it's one reason I'm so thrilled to be here, is that you are making contact with other groups. Because the program that we're working, the program under which we're working, I'm getting my English correct here, so Ruth won't have to drag me down. The program with which we're working is called Christians Confronting the Culture. That's an initiative that our Blackstone Institute has been designing for a year and a half, and our National Legal Forum Board last fall approved their official sponsorship of that, joining Blackstone. And so, because we are so absolutely convinced we've got to start working together. And so, this is the way to do it. And then there's another way I'll be talking about in just a minute, but I'm so impressed with what I have seen of the Salt and Light people also, and the Salt and Light councils and the varied ministries. I've known Matt Staver for a long time. I have not had the pleasure of meeting him as some other attorneys, but know some of the work he did, has done, and continues to do. And I think it's absolutely essential that we all get together. So I'm hoping that it's very much our prayer. National Legal Forum and Salt and Light have had contact, of course, for a long time. But very much hoping that as time goes on, that Salt and Light and Liberty Counsel under Matt will come on board, and we can get us all together as sponsors of what we're doing here, and just magnify them exponentially, the network connections that we'll have. Depending on, I hate to say it, but depending on the computer, we just have to use it. And so anyway, as we do, I was thinking a little bit earlier about a comment that had been posted on one of our leader Facebook pages, and it said, my current great desire to become better informed is very much at war with my desire to keep my sanity. And so that's the way that we may feel after we finish tonight, but we are Christians Confronting the Culture under the general heading, this series of Conversations America in the Twilight of Truth. And of course, this is part 2. I'm going to go ahead and make an announcement about where we go from here. There always, for some of us, has to be a road that we can see, at least a little bit. And so we have talked, Robin and Ruth and I've talked with my National Eagle leaders, and so what we are going to be doing now, having had these great opportunities to meet with you folks in person, and because we won't even begin to cover tonight what we actually needed to cover last time, in my scheme of things, but what we are going to do is to launch another phase of this Confronting the Culture initiative. And that is, we're going to start going online. I hate to say that, but it's certainly wonderful that we have that capacity now. We're going to start going online, and I will start doing live, real-time webinar interactive sessions with people wherever you may be. And we already have the first one set for you folks for the 11th of February. Since you meet on the 3rd Monday, we thought, well, we'll move it back to the 2nd Monday. So we're kind of used to Monday. And I realize that for the Tea Party people, that gets you a little off of your Thursday, but we're off. The National Legal Forum is also going to be doing this, and we're dealing with 40 states and 4 time zones. So this is a lot of what I am called to do. I have no doubt of that. I started teaching at 20. That was a long time ago, and God has just put me right back, okay, this is really a major focus. And if I can't do it like this, which is the best, the next best thing is to do it with just a screen between us. And so it will only be an hour. We will work out the details. My webmaster and I have talked, and so we'll work the details out in the next few days. And so Ruth and Robin will be using your usual channels of communication to let you know how to join that webinar. And we're going to call that our constitutional conversations. It's your turn. And so a lot of the focus will be on what you want to ask and what you want to say within a certain limit of words within the group. Just for right now, those of you who have participated, or if you know someone that you know has a good bit of knowledge, a lot of passion, and would benefit from participating, they're welcome to participate. But this is more of a leadership level effort. Nobody else knows, no other groups are doing this. And so that's where we will go from here. That first one will just be an hour, and we'll just see what happens there and where God takes us from there. But it will be at 7 o'clock on the 11th of February, Monday the 11th of February, 7 o'clock, and just watch for, as I say, your leaders to let you know the details. So what we're going to do tonight, somehow or other, if I have to jump about 40 slides, and it may take that, we are going to deal with the new sexualism. If we're going to have to suffer like some of us have when we are going to deal with that, then we are going to deal with it. So we'll just see as time goes on. One learns in the classroom that you definitely have to flex, shall we say. So this is Christians confronting the culture. And as we said last time, in order to effectively confront the culture, you have to understand, we have to understand, and I'm still learning, 4 fundamental facts. And you have a handout with several slides on there, and this is one of your slides. Now, I had intended to get all the way through number 2 last time. We got through about half of number 1, actually, according to my notes. And I was zipping along, if you remember. And we by the way, we actually, I'm somewhat careful about the time also, because we have an extraordinary treat for you tonight. You're going to see something, you're going to have the opportunity to experience something that no group ever has before. And that is, you are going to see a young man argue in what we call our Blackstone Moot court. This is something that is one of my great passions. God called us into it back in '92 when I was still at Hardin-Simmons. We started it at the collegiate level. I'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute. But anyway, he's going to be arguing, as we do with all of our moot court activities. You argue as you do at the appellate level. For example, the Supreme Court. It's not like the district court, just like your 11th Court of Appeals here. It's that type of an argument. That's where you really get down to the nitty-gritty of the law. And I've been doing that with homeschoolers. We set that up at Hardin-Simmons. It grew all around the state at the collegiate level, exploded to the national level. Now there are over 350 some odd teams that participate. Patrick Henry College, you're familiar with that. Mike Ferris, they tend to dominate. I think they've won 8 out of the last 10 national championships. But we're doing that at the local level. And I've actually done that all the way through graduate school, all the way through master's level. It's a fantastic experience. And everything that we do is an argument against one of the awful cases that the Supreme Court has handed down. And one reason we have to do that now, and we'll be talking about this, folks, is in every major policy area of law, now we are on the wrong side. We have lost every major policy area. And there's going to have to be, well, there are ways to go back, and that's what I hope we can talk about tonight. There's going to have to be some overturning of cases, and there's going to have to be all kinds of arguments made in court, such as have never been made before, for our side. And that's the kind of thing we're talking about. And that's one reason we're calling these conversations, because actually what you have in a court, in an appellate court, is a conversation between the lawyer and the judge. And so I'm thrilled to death to have with me tonight some very dear friends from Abilene, the Sims family, or a portion thereof, Jennifer and Pat, and their son Gavin. You will certainly appreciate this family. Pat just recently separated from the U.S. Air Force. He's an Academy graduate, Air Force Academy graduate, and he flew the C-130s for a number of years, and we're just thrilled to death they decided to stay in Abilene. I had their oldest child, Sophie, 5 years ago. Now she's gone way off to college, and now I just had the privilege of having their oldest son, Gavin. And I think you're going to hear Gavin argue tonight, and we're going to put on a moot court demonstration for you. And I think you will be quite surprised. He is the ripe old age of 13, going on 25. Although this is designed for people, lawyers do it. That's what it's a preparation for. But it's a kind of arguing that everybody in this room needs to be able to do. And you can do it much more easily than you think because it is a conversation. So, having rambled on and on now, what I want to do is go back and summarize the major points of fundamental fact number 1 and 2, and then we're going to drill our attention on 3 because that's where we get to the arguments for our side and against the humanistic worldview. So, fundamental fact number 1, as patriots, we must arm ourselves with the power of knowledge in order to fight effectively in the culture war. We have been accused of being anti-intellectual, and I quoted for you last time from one of our columnists who said, that this was back in the early 80s, said Christians are intellectually unsophisticated and philosophically incompetent. And unfortunately he was right. And things have gotten much more complicated in the time since then. And so we still need a tremendous amount of education, particularly in this area that we're talking about, the Constitution, of course, and the culture war. And we have to understand that, even though we don't like it perhaps sometimes, but it was Madison, the father of the Constitution, who said, knowledge will forever govern ignorance. And the people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives. End quote. So that's what we're doing. We're arming ourselves. We're preparing the troops. And so we just went through that one pretty quickly. Fundamental fact number 2 actually is a quote from, a summary of a quote from one of the most renowned political scientists on the humanistic side. They say some things that are right. And one of the best arguments, best ways of arguing against them is to take their words and show them how, based on their own propositions and assertions, if you carry them out logically, then you end up on our side. And so that's what we're doing. And a very famous political scientist, the middle 20th century, late 20th century, David Easton, who goes around writing the kinds of things that you see in the encyclopedias of political science and law. And he said the ultimate necessity that faces any political system is that of survival. And you have that in one of your slides reprinted there. So the question then becomes, so how does a system survive? How does a political system survive? Which worldview will promote the survival and the thriving of a political system? The humanistic or the Judeo-Christian? And that's a question we're addressing. You already know the answer. But fundamental fact number 3, the Judeo-Christian worldview and the Constitutionist theories, that is, theories about the Constitution, it encompasses protect and promote the American Constitution and our system, while the humanist system defies and destroys the Constitution and our cultural system. And so, great, so what do? Can we do anything? Of course, well, you know, everybody says no, but your being here obviously is testimony you don't agree with on that point. The problem is, what do we do? And so we talk about having the mandate, but also the muscle to fight more effectively in the culture war. And it's really the head we're having to use. So as we were saying earlier, the issue of prayer is fundamental, and you will see that in some of the things that we'll talk about a little bit later on. So that's a summary of the overall points we want to make, and that's, again, the statement from David Easton. And then we have in that a demand, and that is that we must protect and promote the survival and health of the U.S. Constitution. We talked a little bit about that point last time, and so how? And we began that process last time by understanding the fact that we are in a twilight of truth and that we're sinking. We're being dragged by the humanistic worldview more and more into that toxic fog, and the truth is becoming more and more obscure, and we have to understand the elements in that twilight that's closing in around us. And that leads us to a discussion of the culture war, the Constitution, and the courts. And so we were actually in the middle of the culture war last time, and this is where I want us to start new material, I guess you would say tonight. To understand the culture war, you have to understand the basic structure of the battle. And this is where we have fallen short in not having an understanding of the structure. But the point is, the other side doesn't understand this either. And so when you do, and you can start throwing the arguments, that's, you understand a good West Texas term, but you can, it's amazing what kind of response you can get. And let me just give you an illustration. I seem to run into these kinds of things, but Francis Schaeffer, we have mentioned, tremendous influence, some have said, and I would agree, more influential than any other writer on late 20th century thought and Judeo-Christian thought. And Schaeffer has, in his works, an approach to evangelism that I call tension point evangelism. And you're dealing with somebody and you're conversing with them. You're conversing, and we're going to, well, put that money path aside for a minute. You're conversing with them and they bring up a point, and so what do you do with it? It's ridiculous. But anyway, how do you handle that? And that's what Schaeffer talks about. He says you push them back to the absolute ultimate tension point of their thought. And what that means is you push them back to the point where they can't go any farther, and their thought system will not take them any farther, and they find out there's still a long way from reality. The reality that they know and live in is still way over here, and there's a big gap. And the only way to gap that, or to bridge the gap, is to go back, pick up the Judeo-Christian system and go across. And so that's what we're talking about. And so the other day I had gone in, I never asked for trouble. I never asked for trouble. And the first question I have for God when I get to heaven is, why did you put me in law and political science? Because I really don't like conflict. But that he has never answered. So it just says keep going. And so with the support of prayer and so forth of good folks like you, that's humanly speaking what does keep us going. But I was in Best Buy. I'm in Best Buy and the Geek Squad an awful lot because they do computers. And so I was talking with a young man who was a millennial, very nice, very computer savvy. And he said he got to looking at this. And I knew, because this is the way computer geeks are, there's something wrong with your computer, but they see you've got something on there, they're going to have to look at the whole thing. They just got to see it all the way through. So it took a little effort on his part, and I said, well, I'll go back. I'll have some other stuff. I'll come back. So when I came back, he said, we'd gotten to talking a little bit about, I guess it was a homosexual rights thing while I was still there. And when I came back, and he said, well, my boss said I can't talk about politics. And I said, well, I understand. That makes sense. I hadn't initiated the conversation anyway. But he said, but then he could not help it. He said, I looked at all your slides. And I said, oh, really? And he said, yeah, there's a lot of stuff on there I don't agree with. And I said, really? Well, why? Now, this is important because you engage them in a conversation. And I said, so, what was the problem? Well, when I was in homeschooling in a conservative situation, he wants to give me all his conservative credentials, so he ran through all that. He was in the Navy. I don't know, maybe the Navy's more conservative than the Air Force. I'm not sure about that. Anyway, Burl, weren't you in the Navy? Okay.
It depends on when you were in the Navy.
Well,
It depends, right?
So,
He's lost.
He's lost. Anyway, well, fortunately, Pat is not. And he's just a tad over 37. But anyway, so this young man, I'll just call him Derek. So he was going, he said, I learned history when I was growing up. He said, now I know the facts about history. And I said, oh, really? And, he started to, that spiel, and he started to get off on things. And I said, well, it's real interesting. Derek, I said, I've been studying about facts and truth and so forth. I said, I got to wondering, what is a fact? And I went on internet and I started to Google the word fact. And I found a number of different definitions of the word fact, and some of them contradicted each other. And he said, really? And I said, yeah, so what do you really mean by the word fact? And that was the end of the conversation. I wasn't trying to end it, but I hope he's gone home and thought about it. But that's pushing them to the logical end. And there are all kinds of stories about that. So that's an illustration of how God brings these things to you. And so this is factual. But what it entails is that you take an issue and you start with the level that you can actually identify. So you take a specific issue. For example, is abortion protected by the Constitution? Specific act, specific document, specific guarantee. Well, you answer that in the light of the U.S. Constitution. But where does the U.S. Constitution address abortion? It doesn't. But it has words like liberty, and so forth. So the abortionists argue, well, you go down to our basic legal, our very broad legal philosophy, and you look back at past cases, which you'll be hearing about shortly, and you see that liberty encompasses a woman's reproductive freedom, which I'm sure would have absolutely stunned the framers of the Declaration and the Constitution. They literally would have flipped their wig, but anyway, or wigs. But anyway, you're dealing with something much broader. Now, at this point, folks, we understand, number 4, we have some level of 3, but when you get down to level 2 and level 1, we're lost. We don't understand the Judeo-Christian positions there. How could we? We haven't been taught. But let me tell you, the other side doesn't understand their position either. Because their positions are so bankrupt, and they are so thin, like a little piece of tissue, that if you just blow on it, like I did with Derek, it doesn't, it didn't collapse. But I suspect the young man went home and did some thinking. I pray that he did, and will continue to do so. And so that's the way God works. I just went in to get something fixed, to get him to show me how to do something with one of these PowerPoint slides. You just never know. They have to be prepared. So that's the Boy Scout motto, except that's not a good thing to quote anymore either. Another long story. Our legal philosophy, though, the word liberty, for example, is broader than law. So where do you find a broader than law definition of liberty? In our general philosophy, where we talk about the meaning of words and truth, and facts. That's what we call epistemology. That's what you go and get PhDs to learn, is long words like that. I had homeschoolers in Weatherford a number of years ago, and we were getting into this with 14 and 15-year-olds, and we talked about epistemology and axiology, and an awful lot of the time, folks, those are very long words that have very simple meanings. But the academic world is a rather arrogant world, to say the least. And so, anyway, these kids were at home one night, and they were talking at the dinner table. There were 3 of them in my class. They were talking about some of the ologies, and their dad was so impressed. And their mom said, well, don't be too impressed. They know the words, but they don't have the faintest idea what they mean yet. And so, general philosophy is all of these ologies. And it includes what is truth, and where does truth come from, and is it absolute, and how do we know it, facts, and so forth. And of course, then, you come ultimately to the questions of where does it come from, and get you back to the basic religion. And you have those charts on there. That's the structure of a worldview. And it is the Judeo-Christian structure that looks like that as we peel away the exterior versus the humanistic structure as we peel away its exterior that gives us the cultural war with which we deal. And so the threat to our survival then, we can just put into words. That was visual. We can put that into words because as these two structures have come in conflict, what has occurred is that our courts are in chaos, our Constitution is in crisis, and our culture is in collapse. And that's because the courts have fallen under the humanistic hammer. They're using the Constitution, which is thoroughly Judeo-Christian, to try to bludgeon the culture into a humanistic mode, and it won't go, and so the culture is in collapse. That's an awfully short summary of well, actually, depending on how far you want to go back into Europe, a number of decades, a number of centuries. And so, this is a word my students love, verbicide. I didn't invent it, but it's a neat word, and it means just what it sounds like. It's the murder of a word. Anytime you have homicide, genocide, whatever, it's the murder of somebody. And a word is murdered when you deprive it of its essential meaning, and you twist it into something that's different, and in most instances, in the hands of the humanist, opposite to what it meant. And so the Constitution, with words like personhood, life, liberty, and so forth that you're going to be hearing about, has been the victim of verbicide. That's another short verbal summary. And the question then is, what's the answer? What's the prescription? And there's the fivefold answer, which we'll probably only barely touch, but it goes back to the first, and I'm listing them from the most fundamental level up, and the first one is supplication, prayer. And then we go on up from there. So that's an overview of where we should have been probably about 2/3 of the time through our time last time. Now, as we look again at fundamental fact number 2, which has to do with the, if you go back and look on your outlines there, fundamental fact number 2, the ultimate necessity facing us is that of survival. So as we look at that, what we need to understand, first of all, is that our survival is the most threatened in certain policy areas. And those are the core policy areas of your culture. And what I'm going to show you is the policy area and then the two worldviews and how they clash. You know this. This is a summary of what you know. Religious liberties. Judeo-Christian respects liberties, especially ours, because ours are the ones under the greatest attack. Humanistic worldview, protection of anti-orthodox viewpoints, and the attack on the orthodox is protected. Evolution versus creationism, you know the split positions there. That's one of the oldest issues that's hit us. Abortion life issues, you know the positions there. And then what I have called, and we're using this term, and it is actually in the dictionary. I didn't just invent it, but it's not being... the last time I looked, and I went on the internet and tried to count, there were 7 letters and a plus, LGBTIQIA plus. So that's the new sexualism. And the article said plus means not anything in particular, but it's something that's probably out there, but we haven't run into it yet. Which is basically what the article said. It really is, you have to laugh. What else can you do sometimes? But it is indeed a wry laugh at times. And so that incorporates all these and plus, whatever we may discover the plus to be. So, pro-sexual morality or family, pro-sexual mayhem, the opposites of the worldviews of these core issues. And these are the core issues where we focus our attention. Because you resolve those one way or the other, and as I say, in every area we're losing. We've lost the courts. There's a top decision controlling law in those areas. Now, it's been a gradual process. So something else that we need to understand is how it's spread, but it's a logical process. Religious liberties went first because of the manner in which the courts began to define liberty. Now, the Constitution says government cannot establish religion, i.e. it cannot favor or disfavor a particular religious group, but they took it on themselves to define religion. What deeper involvement in religion can you have than that? But in 1961, the courts in Picasso versus Watkins, I bet you don't read about that in the morning paper, or do you have long discussions with anybody about that one. But the Supreme Court said there, a religion can be a belief system even though there is no God, any way similar to the God of the Old and New Testament. So you can have a godless religion, which means anything can be a religion. And I'm serious, folks. I used to track, I can't do it now, but I used to track what was happening in the lower courts. And there was one organization that wanted to be recognized by the government as religious, and their worship activity was I need to say this carefully, flying airplanes. Okay. I'm serious, not flying. I mean, it would have made more sense for them to just be talking about flying by themselves, but they wanted to be recognized for flying airplanes as a religion. That was a sin. Now the court, at that point, that was several decades ago. I've been in this business a long time. They actually lost. But if you take God out of the equation, then you've got just about anything left. 1968, Epperson versus Arkansas, the Supreme Court threw out the Arkansas law that you can remember. I can remember those cases. That was Arkansas, and in that particular case, the state had a teach creation only law. And the courts said you can't do that. You can teach only evolutionism, required, but you can't require teaching only creationism. And then that led, of course, to later decisions. But that then puts the courts imprimatur on the concept that man is an animal. Well, if there is no God, then why not? There is no source from which man derives anything superior to animalhood. So, if that's the case, then why not in 1973 allow the unborn to be destroyed? Heard a debate a while ago, boy, that was a long time ago, between Phyllis Schlafly, the founder, of course, now gone, from this earth anyway, between Phyllis Schlafly and a lawyer named Sarah Weddington. Does that ring a bell with anybody? Who was Sarah Weddington? Oh, it rings a bell. Yeah, it is. Pardon? Sarah Weddington was one of the chief lawyers involved in arguing Roe versus Wade on behalf of abortion. And I could say a lot about Sarah Weddington. I happen to have known her, but I would resist. That's another bunny path I won't go down. But I wouldn't want her for my lawyer. And anyway, she and Phyllis got in an argument. Never get in an argument with Phyllis Schlafly. And so Sarah was using the usual argument, well, it's actually just a zygote. That was her comment. And Phyllis's comment was, well, why don't you just call it a cactus? It would be as meaningful. And so, anyway, that's where you go with the third of the issue areas, abortion and life. And in view of all of that, then, over 1996, this was a Colorado case where the Colorado State Constitution, these were, you know, not what we call conservative states, but they had added an amendment to the Constitution banning same-sex, against, it was an anti-homosexuality, homosexual conduct, anti-homosexual conduct provision, and of course threw it out for reasons that we'll talk about. So at that point then homosexual rights entered the national scene. But you see how by the time you come down to Romer, there's no God, men aren't persons, so what difference does it make? What difference is marriage? There's no such thing as marriage. Because you knocked out all of the props that are essential to the Judeo-Christian, which of course is a correct understanding of marriage. Okay, now if you look at this whole culture war from a little different perspective, you can see that as we look at social policy areas, and I'm just giving you some examples. There's been, every time social policy has come under the acts of humanistic courts, there's been a constitutional victim, there's been a bunch, but I'm giving you one illustration. And there's been a cultural victim. And I think that will become clearer when I go through this. Evolutionism. The constitutional victim is personhood. And what we're talking about in particular here is the 14th Amendment. I didn't put that in this section of slides, but the 14th Amendment says, among other things, no state can deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. No person can be deprived of life, liberty, without due process of law. So you've got four guarantees there. Personhood, life, liberty, and law. And so obviously with evolutionism, the victim is, the constitutional victim in the 14th Amendment is personhood. Well, the cultural victim is the individual. In American society, the individual in society, the individual is a basic building block of society. The individual is important in and of himself, not because of the family to whom he was born, the political party to which he ascribes, or anything, in and of himself. But if he's nothing more than an animal, you knocked all of the meaning out of the word individual. So the individual as that basic institution in society loses the meaning. Abortion, obviously life, is the cultural victim, is the constitutional victim. I put civil law and government here. I could have put a bunch of anything. Most of these you could just interchange left and right. Why civil law and government? Because the ultimate purpose of government is to protect life. And if government does not protect life, nobody else will. So the cultural victim is civil law and government because it's actually become the instrument for destroying life rather than for protecting it. And if that's not destruction of government, I'm not sure how you would define it. Then the new sexualism. Well, constitutional victim, the word liberty, because that's what they love to use, or what they love to employ in their march toward more and more verbicide. And of course the family is a cultural institution that we have lost. And then finally, religious liberties. I'm not listing these necessarily in a particular order. Religious liberties, and I put law, and the reason for this, because I wanting us to think about different ways that these elements relate to one another. And we may talk about it, probably not tonight, but come around on the 11th of February. I hope these sessions will just become something that we do ongoing, because we're just barely scratching the surface, folks. And so, law, I put as the constitutional victim, no person to be deprived, again, quoting from the 14th Amendment, because, as has been said so well by one of the great British scholars, whom I thought we might get to in quote tonight, but probably won't. His name was Alfred Lord Denning. He had one of his title was Master of the Rolls, one of those wonderful British titles that defy meaning and understanding to us egalitarian Americans. But anyway, that's a third-ranking judicial official of the British Empire, thoroughgoing Christian. And he wrote and spoke a good bit of American in the middle late 20th century. And he said, I hope we can have time to quote a little bit more than this. He said, without religion, there can be no morality. Without morality, there can be no law. So if you have destroyed religious liberties, you don't have a solid foundation for law. And that's why I'm, again, just trying to make us think of different ways that these various elements interrelate. That's what I'm an interrelater and a coupler. I don't know, well, I won't go down that buddy path either. Okay, the cultural victim. Obviously, if you're going to tear up religious liberties, then the church as we know it is gone. And if you're going to let government, number one, define religion, and let it, number two, define religion as anything, you don't even have to have a God, capital G, then what kind of protection for a church do you have, and what kind of protection do we have when we see the things happening that have been happening all up and down the spectrum, particularly and most recently, of course, with the new sexualism. So that's a way of looking at, excuse me, at looking at this cultural war. Here's another way that's more visual. The destruction of personhood and the dignity of man occurred with the evolution cases. But with that, we actually had the destruction of God. We didn't have to have Torcaso versus Watkins. Why? Here's another reasoning thing. We're going to become philosophers. Remember I told you last time? You're already deeply into this. You are really doing well as philosophers. You're still sitting there, you're still breathing, and you haven't turned white and gasped and gone into a fetal position, so you're doing well with this. Why would we say that if you lost personhood, you destroyed God? Well, the evolutionists have really done that.
It remain God's image.
Right. That's right. And if you get the theistic evolutionists going, and they say, yeah, we believe in God, but God's, man was created by an evolutionary process, then you are actually making God a God of evolution, and you are making God, since man is created in his image, an animal.
A lot of people don't even know what the 7 Judeo principles are.
No, they don't understand the Judeo-Christian principles, and we don't within the church too often, and that's part of the problem. So we're trying to self-educate here very quickly and very thoroughly. But when you define man as an animal, and then you say God created man, look what you've done to God in the process. It's a little scary. Sanctity of life, obviously, if there is no meaning to personhood, as we've already said, the sanctity of life goes out the door, and so does any concept of order and liberty. All that you have is a herd of cattle or horses. I mean, most of us in here know what a herd of cattle and horses are. Herds are. We were talking coming over about horses because they're into horses, and my husband and I were into horses. And so we were talking about some of the funny things that happen with horses. They're fun, but they're not very orderly. And you have to exert a great deal of influence in certain ways in order to make them orderly. I did not do that one time with a new horse I was trying out, and I loosened the reins too much. We were loping along, and the next thing I knew, I was airborne, and I flew over his head, parallel to the ground, and landed full body, face down, in the dirt. And only by the grace of God did I suffer nothing worse than a broken left wrist. Unfortunately, I'm right-handed. But I should have been broken up a zillion times. That's another whole story. But when we're talking about order, you don't have that in any meaningful sense with animals. So we have destroyed sanctity of life and the concept of order and liberty, and therefore there's nothing to law. There's nobody to make the laws. There's nobody over whom the laws can prevail. There's no meaning to law. Make sense?
Yeah.
Very simple, really, isn't it, when you look at it laid out like that? But, okay, that's the culture war. Now, as much as I hate to, that gets us through point 1, sort of. And so, our discussion, our session with Gavin is not going to take a long time, but how much longer, where's Robin? Yeah. We'll take maybe 15 minutes, and everybody's been really patient. Do you want to go ahead and let's stop and take report, or continue a little bit more with this?
I'll leave it up to you.
Robin? Oh, come on now, that's not.
I think we could do a little bit more.
Okay. Shall we jump to number 3 in the new sexualism then? If I'm gonna take a beating over that today, well, I would like to jump down there. Okay, in that regard then, let me see where I need to go with our slides.
Would you have room for one question?
Oh, sure, I'm sorry, Richard, I needed to, allow for questions.
The two branches that we have here, humanist and Judeo-Christian, I see that the Muslims are coming in now and they seem to be siding with the humanists.
Exactly.
However, they are in direct conflict with the humanists. I mean, they're siding together, but their basic theories are totally diametrically opposed.
Right, and that's an excellent point. It's an excellent point to make about all of the different groups that you'll find in the humanistic movement. Because there's no absolute, then as long as you don't accept the Judeo-Christian independent, you don't accept the theistic God, the Judeo-Christian worldview, that who is transcendent, personal, supreme. If you don't have that foundation, and then all you're left with is whatever, and that comes under the branch of humanism. There are many, there's innumerable numbers
Yeah.
of branches of humanism.
So the enemy of my enemy is my enemy.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Yeah,
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
yeah, that's right. So the God of the Judeo-Christian tradition is transcendent, infinite, and personal. He's all three. And he is totally unique in that regard. Transcendent, infinite, and personal. But he is, in his personalness, a being who has related to us because we are created in his image, not because we are transcendent or infinite, unlimited, but because we are personal. And so that's the connection again. That reminds me, and I will share this with you. I remember many years ago a pastor saying, or it was a speaker at some kind of event, that a Muslim and a Christian were standing at the tomb of Muhammad. And the Muslim pointed to the tomb and he said, "That's the grave of my God." And the Christian said, "That's the difference between your religion and mine."
There you go.
So without the Judeo-Christian God, you go in your direction. And I think that maybe is if there is one sentence that explains the chaos that we've had since 2016, but my word, the chaos since the elections in November. Yeah, it's finally just really, the birds are coming home to roost. So, okay, let me see if I can jump ahead. And let's see. As we fight the battle, okay, if I need to get some new glasses here, I haven't yet. Okay, let's see what we can do. Well, let me do this. It's supposed to be, I need my guy from the Geek Squad. There's supposed to be a way that you can, we'll take the easy way out. See what you're missing? This is a scan of everything that you're missing. Okay. All right. There are fatal flaws in the humanistic system. And this goes to level 3 on that worldview diagram and to level 2B, legal philosophy and the Constitution. First fatal flaw I refer to is the 3 C's of systemic survival, then the systemic stress, that's a tongue twister, categorical necessity of categories, and the deadly dichotomy of facts versus values. Let me try to explain very quickly what we're talking about here. The 3 C's of systemic survival. A system has to survive, okay? That requires the 3 C's, again, borrowing from a great British philosopher on the secular side. Well, now I need my Geek Squad guy, don't I? Oh, boy. Okay, H.L.A. Hart, definitely British, 3 initials. And so he said, for our systems to survive, It has to have certainty, or we have chaos. It has to have consistency. That means different rules and standards within your system are consistent with one another, but they're also consistent with reality outside of the system. So there has to be internal consistency, but there has to be external. Law that throws in the face of reality, like the transgender protection laws, is inconsistent. But we have contradiction. And then thirdly, you have to have continuity, whereas we have convolution. You have to have from one legal act proceeding to the next, you have to have a straight line, and it keeps going through history. But what we have is an extremely contorted, twisted, convoluted line as we move through the legal system and between the legal system and the culture. So we've lost the 3 C's. That's the 3 C's of systemic survival down the Q's. Okay, the second, oh boy. I'm sorry folks, all right, let me go back. This we're just going to stick with. The stress is systemic stress. When David Easton was writing about systemic survival and said that you've got to have, as your ultimate necessity in any political system or legal system, you've got to survive. That's the ultimate necessity. He said also a whole bunch he wrote all kinds of books. They really could have been summarized in 1 or 2 articles. That's something else we're extremely good about in academia. You can say it with 20 words, and instead of 3, then say it with 20. At least until I got to my dissertation, and then I had a committee that viewed things differently, and boy, I had, the 20 words instead of 3. I mean, they got a scalpel, and they butchered my dissertation. But I did learn about being, this was their word, parsimonious with my words. I learned to be sparing and stick to the absolute necessity. You get a vocabulary too. So when you read Schaefer, you get a vocabulary. You expect you to know everything about every field he discusses. And so when I read the first Schaefer book, which is the hardest one, The God Who Is There, I went to the library at Hardin-Simmons. I got the Encyclopedia of Music, Art, Literature, History, Philosophy, every word I read into that I didn't know I had to look up. And I made progress about 3 pages of an hour through that book. But you sure do gain a broad knowledge. So anyway, that's the scholar. And so in regard to systemic stress, Easton gives us this long exposition which simply says one of the biggest dangers, perhaps the greatest danger to survival is what he calls cleavage, internal dissension. Dissension between the group's individuals' values within a political or legal system. I mean, this is not rocket science, is it? He turns into Mr. Political Science for writing this, and he became probably the most famous guru in American political science in the 20th century. And so, so you're going to have systemic stress, and what do we have in America today if we don't have internal stress? My word, the way we've been going and the things we've already talked about make that clear. And we'll talk a little bit more about this and trying to summarize in a minute, but I do want to share a quote from Scalia, Justice Antonin Scalia. When a case was handed down in 2003, and it was a Texas case, we got the acts in Texas with the sodomy laws in Texas in 2003, with the abortion laws in 1973, and so this was 2003, and in that case, Scalia, who dissented because the court threw out our anti-sodomy law, and all of the other states, there were about a dozen that had laws that still did not legalize sodomy and homosexual behavior. And so here's what Scalia said. He was a boardmaster, and I love Scalia, and I think everybody should have read some Scalia. But he said, what a massive disruption of the current social order overturning the sodomy laws will entail. And that's systemic stress. Okay, categorical necessities of categories. This one is awfully important when we get to the new sexualism. You have to have categories. Think about trying to have law without having a category of activities that is murder and a category that is non-murder, or that is theft and non-theft. Law has to have categories. Life has to have categories. And we're not gonna have time to get to this, I know, so I'll go ahead and throw it in. Associated with that inevitably is that you have to have absolutes. A category has an absolute essential core, and then it has limits beyond which the application of that core cannot extend. If I say to you, I said a minute ago, we had horses, you knew immediately what I was talking about. Because there is an essential horsiness out there, referring to the animal, not to the way people act sometimes. But you have a large animal. I was, for some, well, never mind. That was another stupid thing I did with horses, but if one steps on you and you're underneath him and kicks you in the head with his iron shoe, you know you are digging steps. No wonder I've been a little diggy ever since. So you have a large animal. He doesn't have feathers. He has hair. He has 4 legs, not 2. His method of locomotion is land, preferably. There were a couple of times when we were on trail rides that ours went airborne without telling us about it because there was a little gully and we didn't know it was coming, but they did, and over we went. Fortunately, we did stay on the horses. But they preferably are better if at least 2 feet are in contact with the ground. You're not talking about little tiny things that have feathers and 2 legs and major method of locomotion is airborne. That's category, but there is an essential absoluteness to that. There's a core that, and when you say, this is another point that we won't get to, but when you say there is no absolute, you have made an absolute statement. So you can't go anywhere with that, just with relativism. Everything is relative is an absolute statement. And so that pretty well ends the discussion, except they don't like that. I've gotten in a lot of discussions about that. So, personhood, life, liberty, law are categories. And they have an absolute center, and they have fixed limits within which that center applies. And you can't go any farther. That's a category. So what happens then when we pass a law that outlaws homosexual conduct? Well, all of a sudden you can't have homosexual conduct versus heterosexual conduct, illegalize one and accept the other, because those are categories, but that is what? Discrimination in violation of the equal protection of the laws. Now, there are all kinds of little problems with that, but one of the problems is that every law distinguishes. It makes differences. And so the question is, are the distinctions valid? And I do want to say this, and one other thing, and then I'm going to quit. Because this is how unbelievably ridiculous, scary the courts have gotten. In 2013, the Supreme Court decided a couple of cases, Perry versus Hollingsworth and the Windsor case, Windsor versus U.S. Those were the first cases where the Supreme Court dealt with same-sex marriage. The original decision in one of those cases, Perry versus Hollingsworth, was in California. A federal district judge, one federal district judge made the initial decision in that one case, Perry versus Hollingsworth. And one of the most important things he did, which is always characteristic of district court hearings, and it distinguishes them from higher court hearings, like you're going to see in a minute, is they make findings of fact. For example, in a murder trial, does the evidence show beyond any reasonable doubt that Major Sims over here went on a wild frenzy and killed his wife? Now that's a factual question that's not suggesting anything. It's so ridiculous that I could use the example. The point is that you have to have facts clearly established before the law can be applied. And so a reasonable average person, the average man's standard, supposedly will allow you to have a jury. When you go on up the line into the higher courts, you never have juries because you're always deciding issues of law, supposedly. And therefore you have, we don't know the law, judges don't either, but that's got to be irrelevant. But you don't have juries, you have multiple judges, 3 or more. Okay, so here's Judge Walker sitting out there in Northern California, Northern District of California, back in 2010, first hearings on Perry versus Hollingsworth, and he makes findings of fact. Now, I should have mentioned, did I forget to mention that Judge Von Walker was a practicing homosexual? and had been in a relationship with one man for at least 10 years. And he makes the findings of fact. And I was checking again, going back in my fact checker and so forth, several places. His findings of fact have governed every same-sex marriage and homosexual rights case that has gone to the top of the federal court system. Now, so you want to know what some of those are? You're going to love these. And I'm going to read these because I don't want to misstate something. Same-sex marriage bans are based on animus or hatred toward homosexuals. No other possibility. And religious beliefs that gay and lesbian relationships are harmful or inferior to heterosexual relationships harm gays and lesbians. End quote. Now, these are his findings of fact. Thus, and he also forgot to mention, he gives us in this 139-page opinion, I thought about bringing it, but I was dragging too much else. And even Pat was getting way down here. 18 points in his opinion, 18 points to prove that the Bible condemns homosexuality. What's one of the biggest problems we have in the church right now? What's happening over in Abilene at Abilene Christian University? And it scares me to death because of what's going on sort of behind the scenes, but it's exploding more and more in front of the scenes. Tolerance, acceptance, and even celebration of homosexuality, and somehow or other just eliminating the Bible. I mean, some of us are really going to get in trouble one of these days. Well, all of us are going to get in trouble one way or the other. It's just which deity is going to get us. I shouldn't even give Satan that much, but anyway, somebody is going to get us. But they're dealing with fundamentally serious problems over there. And so there's a huge argument going on. The Bible doesn't really condemn homosexuality. That's it. And Vaughn Walker has written into the records of the federal judiciary, the Bible condemns homosexuality and gives us 18 points. And I've got a number of other documents, which I also thought about bringing but didn't, that prove beyond any doubt that the Bible is anti-homosexual conduct. Now, if that's the case, folks, think what's happened. The higher courts said, yep, he's right. Those have never been challenged, his findings of fact. So the higher courts say, yep, that's right, but they go ahead and uphold same-sex marriage, not just as a right, but a fundamental right under the Constitution, which directly violates the Christian religion, as proven by Judge Walker, which therefore makes the federal courts in the position, puts them in the position of establishing anti-Christian religions as the religions of the nation, and opens the door for what's happened, a violation by the government under the constitutional protections of every right we as Christians have to free expression, to freedom of exercise of our religion, and any other freedoms you want to mention, right? That's where we are. And
How do we fight
there.
that? How do we fight that?
Well, there are several ways to go about that. Can I ask you to tune in? That's one of the big things we've got to talk about. One of the things that we have to do is to reveal what's happening. Church has no idea.
No.
That's one reason you're here, you're leaders. Salt and Light is reaching the churches. That's where we need to go. The church needs to understand these things. They need to read Vaughn Walker's 18 points. I'll be glad to send you Vaughn Walker's 18 points. Because it's a huge listing of religious groups. It's not just the Southern Baptist Convention. I'm not a Baptist, but I think the world of Southern Baptists, but you know, they're the ones who usually get blamed with all of this.
There goes liberal.
It's not just they, it's all kinds of religious groups. It's evangelical Protestants, it's conservative Jews, it's Orthodox Catholics, it's the Orthodox Church of America, which is sort of the American version of the Eastern Orthodox Church, etc. And in one brief that was filed in one of those cases, just one brief on our side, there were 19 religious groups, including the SBC, filing that, and they claimed that this was a claim under law. We represent over 50 million Americans. And they were just flung out on their noses by the courts. But we need to understand that's happening. Sometimes a little education goes a long way. So, okay.
Question, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Similar to that question is, are you going to address in the future, or even tonight any at all, when there's an action, there needs to be a reaction. Are you gonna get into that reaction of all these different things that we come against and how to go about it?
Yeah.
What's your idea and outlook of the outcome of
Right.
what is gonna happen?
That's kind of the fundamental question beyond just what's going on and who's responsible. The answer is yes and no. Yes, we are going to address it. That's point 4. We have the muscle and the mandate, but no, we won't do it tonight because we don't have time. So as much as we all love to stay, I'm sure, till 2 o'clock in the morning, I might even begin to run down.
So can I ask a question? I'm
Yes,
from
ma'am.
Hood County, I'm not from this area. Will we be able to log in or get instructions?
You bet.
Show on how to do
Oh,
that?
yeah, hey, thank you. I'm so glad you asked that. If anybody anywhere is interested in this, then what we'll do is my webmaster will set up, incidentally, I have a neat webmaster. She is the leader of the Women's Bible Study Fellowship in Abilene. Now, how on earth she does it all, I don't know. But anyway, she's great. And so we'll have an access code. And I've got to work out, I'm not sure, because Ruth and Ruby and Robin and I didn't have time to figure this out, but there'll need to be some way that we can get you registered, get
Well,
you
Ruth
information.
knows me, so
Yeah.
she has my email and all my
Right,
contact
yeah.
information, so.
You're Granbury.
You'll be
Yes,
Granbury.
we are.
Good. Love Granbury. Wonderful lake. Nearly drowned on water skis a bunch of times.
Yeah.
Sucked up half the lake.
We're glad you did it.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, at least it wasn't as bad as getting thrown by my horse. So I've had an exciting life. All right, one final comment. And so in answer to your question, one of the big things we are going to talk about in what we're calling it your turn. That'll be the hour-long sessions. And we want to have also a feedback mechanism where you can send questions. It'll be a lot more expeditious if I have them beforehand. But we just haven't had time because I just got to my webmaster over the weekend. She and I you can understand how she's a rather busy lady. And I have a few things going on.
Well, it's similar to what my grandfather used to tell me. He says, you don't have the right to complain about an issue unless you have a way to
Exactly.
solve it.
Yes, and one of the things that I'm most concerned about addressing is how do we deal with this explosion of the radicalized left that we now have most, I guess.
I would say, did y'all watch the pro-life march? Did you hear about the pro-life march they had a couple of days ago?
Yeah,
100,000 people showed, and a majority of them were millennials.
that's an important thing
But
to
it
remember.
wasn't because of faith, it was because of science, and that's why they
That's
were
right.
showing up.
That's right, but we're losing them on the
Right,
what's my word, secularism issue.
right.
Now, and so, now we have this group though, we have the Harrises and the Bookers and Ocasio-Cortezes and heaven help us. And, when you're dealing with folks who are so narcissistic, irrational, and hateful, how do we deal with that? That's a part of what we need to answer. And I've dealt with those folks because, not this particular brand, but a lot of it started in the universities. And I have more stories than you'd ever want to hear about what I've been called, including at a very large church university, not too far down that way, which I won't name, but its colors are green and gold, and it is, has as a mascot a bear.
Yes.
And I was called a bunch of things at a law conference one time. So, yeah, I've had to deal with that.
And we've also had a lady come and talk to us one time, Regina Scott from Stevensville area.
Yeah.
And she was an ex-teacher, she went out and did a lot of research of how many Muslim organizations are funding our universities.
Right.
And I mean, all of them.
The whole education
TCU,
system.
Baylor, all of them, Christian colleges, everybody.
The whole education system. There is a way to deal with that, but we have to know it, and we have to be adept at using the tools. And the different kinds of people on the other side, groups, will definitely have an awful lot to do with which, it's like the difference between what's a big armament on an airplane.
I'm sorry.
What's a big armament on an airplane?
I want to say Tomahawk missile, but not really a Tomahawk missile, but the AMRAAM.
What?
An AMRAAM.
The AMRAAM missile. Okay.
Yeah.
It's the difference between the AMRAAM missile and a pop gun. I got the pop gun.
There you go.
Yeah,
That's
but
perfect.
The missile, I have no idea what C-130s are, the big.
Well, we don't have any.
We have to be sure we deal with the folks with whom we are discussing, folks we are confronting, we've got to deal with them in the right way, or we're going to be worse off. And boy, that is a challenge. Yes, sir.
Don't you think that the absolutes of democracy and being a republic play a part? You know, like, it always starts in bondage, and then you go to a spiritual awakening, and that gives you liberty or courage. Courage gives you freedom,
Right.
and then freedom gives you an abundance, and then abundance takes you to complacency, and then apathy, and back into bondage.
It's a spiral.
Yeah, and we just kind of sit around in complacency for so long.
Well, we knew, some of us back in the 60s, that things were going wrong, because things were going wrong with all kinds of disorder, et cetera, under the guise of liberty and freedom and equality, and what was happening was verbicide. They were taking our words, but they were using their meanings, and we didn't catch it for several decades. And the very words that you're talking about were ones they stole. They stole the vocabulary. Remember I said last time, those of you who are here, there are two things we've got to do. We've got to identify the issue. We've got to be sure it's properly identified, and we've got to define the terms like liberty, life, personhood. Because we lose on either one of those, there's no further discussion. So, all right, one final comment, and I want to talk, and that has to do with the deadly dichotomy, facts versus values. That's the last fatal flaw that's the last one we'll talk about, but it covers a multitude of sins. Dichotomy is a two-part something. The item you're talking about is two-part. And in the humanistic handling of law, there are facts and there are values. It's like my friend Derek at Geek Squad was trying to tell me. There are facts, that's what he learned in history, and there are values, and that's what you are seeing on my slideshow. These are all values, okay? Including what Von Walker, after 10 years, at least 10 years with a same-sex partner, is deciding are facts. Okay, in Walker's opinion, here are, let me back up. The fact versus value split came to us from Schaeffer, Francis Schaeffer. He talked about the upper-lower story. Any of you who remember Schaeffer, the upper story, yeah, there is absolute truth, and if man can apprehend it, and there is hope and so forth, but it's out yonder somewhere. It's in what we call the the phenomenal realm, and you may get it back in the 60s, you got it, that was a philosophical reason for using drugs. It was one of the earliest justifications, because you could tap into the ultimate reality of the world of spirit. But hey folks, that's not new to our century. These things have been coming around from the very beginning. You know, go back and read the Bible. Start with Genesis 1, and you'll see it over and over and over again. Okay, so anyway, I lost my train of thought. That's not too easy to get me derailed. Okay, so Schaeffer has the upper story. The lower story, that's where we have facts. And that's what's right around us. And we can apprehend that. Those are reasonable. We can apprehend them with our five senses. But that's the only truth that we can know. Okay. The legal world, academic world, has turned that into what Nancy Schaeffer, Nancy Piercy, some of you may remember from Charles Colson days, Breakpoint. She's now a professor at Houston Baptist. Incredible lady. I had the opportunity to get to know her a little bit when I was on temporary assignment down there. We had some absolutely fascinating conversations. And I do want to say this because she said it one time. She was identified by a magazine on the other side, The Economist, as America's foremost and influential evangelical Protestant female thinker. I think I got all the adjectives in there. But just as you know, normal acting and so forth, we got in a conversation, and the total over a little period of time was 4 hours. And wonderful. And she said at the end, you know, we've talked 4 hours and we didn't disagree on a thing. Now, if you got 4 hours of conversation between two tough-minded, hard-willed women like us, and there's nothing we disagree on, it has to be God. It has to be true. And one of my dreams, one of these days, is to have another Labrie out at Solid Rock Camps and to have Nancy Piercy to come out there and be one of the visiting professors. And there are a lot of other academicians and lawyers and so forth that I've had great privilege of knowing, learned tremendously from them, and I would love to see them. And she would be, she actually studied under Schaefer in Switzerland at Labrie. She went over there to study violin and ended up finding the Lord and finding her husband. And so anyway, so she says, what has happened is that nowadays we don't talk about upper lower story, we talk about fact versus value, and that's what Von Walker did. And so he gives us these fact findings, and let me just share, I've already shared a couple of things with you here, but judicial decisions have to be based only on fact. A fact is provable by science and its progeny, the social sciences. Now that's enough said right there, folks. I can tell you, I have 3 degrees in the social sciences, and they're about as scientific as the West Texas weather in terms of predictability and in terms of all kinds of things that you're supposed to have in order to be scientific, but I'm getting ahead of myself. All right, okay, there are a couple of other things. There is indisputable, his word, support for same-sex marriage by the social sciences. I don't doubt that. I won't tell you any more about all the troubles I got into, but you can imagine. Opposition to same-sex marriage is solely based on moral and religious views that are inherently non-fact. Hatred is central to opposition to marriage, and then this business about its being anti-homosexual is harmful. Now, here are some of the problems. Here are some of the problems. This is from Armstrong, well, and a number of others. And this is one of the most important things. We just said a minute ago, when you say everything is relative, you made an absolute statement. When you say a fact has to be proven by science, you can't prove that statement scientifically. I have yet to find a PhD in any science that can do it. You've got to apply the scientific method and things like that. You can't prove the very basic statement on its own ground, which wipes out the whole argument from that point on. Make sense? Now, what would happen to the church if we suddenly, how liberating would that be to our action, if we understand that? But anyway, let's go ahead here. Of course, other things, we've already picked up. They're reducing the Judeo-Christian opposition to same-sex marriage to hatred is utterly ridiculous. Well, I don't want to steal Gavin's thunder. He's going to use a Scalia statement in a minute, but it applies to what we're talking about here. Final comment. This is it. This is really the final. What all of this does is profoundly affect the humanist and profoundly affect the Judeo-Christian. And as far as the new sexualism is concerned, we were talking about this coming over here. It teaches, and this is your sequence sort of, it teaches, first of all, toleration, then acceptance, then celebration, and finally, elevation. And we have 12 members of Congress in this new Congress who are in the new sexualist movement.
Yes.
And then what, 3 Hindus, 3 Buddhists, something like that. But anyway, now they wouldn't necessarily accept this, but,
Catholic,
pardon?
163 Catholic.
Yeah, we picked up, I understand, 17 or 18 evangelical Protestants, but we lost on the other side. But anyway, that's your sequential development.
Say that one more time.
Okay. First of all, you trivialize Christianity. I'm sorry. No, I was talking about the sectors. I'm sorry. You toleration, acceptance, celebration. Good for you. You came out of the closet. Yeah, wow. And finally, elevation. They want to have fundamental rights. They want to be elected to Congress. And I will only say this, we were talking about it coming over, this business of being accepted, celebrated, elevated. Acceptance in the sense that, yes, they are people. Christians fall into this, that is sin, but to take it any farther, to celebrate, to elevate as a society, takes us way beyond the pale. And I have had personal experiences, at least 2 points in my life, one a long time ago, one very recently, with very close friends who had come out of same-sex relationships before I had known them or before we had become friends. And in one instance, The Lord delivered her. She never had anything to do with it, but she always has been emotionally a little, I guess, different. She can't relate emotionally in the way that women normally relate to one another, in terms of warmth and closeness and so forth. The other one didn't get far enough out of the homosexual community. She had a real heart. She was really disturbed about the others caught in that, and she wanted to go back and help them. And without going into any details, suffice it to say that I have no idea how many hours, weeks, months I spent pleading with her not to do that. They retired from Abilene, went to Dallas, got in the middle of a nest, and she's totally fallen off the edge of the world. Southern Seminary had an excellent conference a few years ago on this, and one of the speakers said this. He said, if you live on the edge long enough, eventually you'll fall in. And she fell in. Now, I cannot tell you, Jennifer and I were talking that there was actually a conference in Abilene, and I missed it, and I'm sorry. You don't hear, what about parents of these folks? And of course we need to reach out to them, my word. That's not the point, and they are not, the gay bashing is terrible. But what we're talking about here are societal policies. We're not talking about individual relationships. And when you're talking about an individual relationship, I can tell you in my situation, having lost both of my parents, my husband, an awful lot of other folks close to me, losing that one friend to that sinful lifestyle was the most painful experience I've ever gone through. Because it didn't have to happen, and it happened because of deliberate, willful, knowledgeable choice. I will always love her. And the last thing I said to her when she turned her back and walked away from me a year ago was, I love you. And I do. And I always will. But it's like Amos says, how can two walk together if they be not agreed? And that separation is indescribably painful. So I am not talking about something, and the other side can't say, well, you don't know what you're talking about. I do know what I'm talking about. And we need to be addressing that. So I'm waiting for somebody. There are lots of people who I'm sure wanted to come and counsel me. They figure I need a lot of counseling, so that's a good place to start. All right, final comment, and then we are going to have something you're really going to enjoy. I'm sorry, folks, it really, we actually went 3 hours with the class in Houston one time on the same-sex thing and didn't realize that we had gone 3 hours. It was a graduate class, and we didn't know 3 hours had passed. We haven't been here 3 hours, I guarantee you. But we didn't realize 3 hours had passed. We didn't even take a water break or anything. All these students came coming in. My word, 3 hours. I think the important thing you take away from this is if you really get down to the truth, people are gripped with it. It's not dull and boring and people are falling asleep. Now, I asked y'all are awfully good actors. Bless you for being, you're the best set of actors. You're going to get the blue ribbon for one of the best groups that I've ever talked to. But we're just getting started, and that's why these It's Your Turn sessions are so terribly important. I'm horribly frustrated that we don't have, and we can't begin to cover. It's kind of like defining the universe in 25 words. But there is a word of encouragement there are many words of encouragement, but I would say this, and then I'll introduce to you the conclusion of the program, and I'm sure the high point. Samuel Adams was the father of the Revolution. I remember him. And the Black World Regiment. And Samuel Adams says this: it is not necessary to have a majority to prevail, but rather a irate and tireless minority keen on setting brush fires in people's minds. Amen. And that's our job. If they have a one-sentence description of what it is we're to do, that's it. How? That's the question. Now, all of this for us in Blackstone comes together in what we call our Moot Court program. That's a simulated proceeding such as you would have in your 11th Court of Appeals. And every student argues from a set of cases that we selected, and they are the big definitive cases in these 4 issue areas that we've talked about. And in every instance, the case is bad, and it needs to be overturned. So every student is arguing, based on the materials we give, that blah, blah, blah versus blah, blah, blah should be overturned. And in those tribunals, as I say, you have no jury, but you always have 3 or more judges. You're supposedly dealing only with questions of law, not with questions of fact. And so it's a very simple thing to set up. So what we're going to have tonight is a moot court presentation. I've been doing moot court. We started it at Hardin Simmons at the collegiate level in '92. So, and I was very much involved in that, so we've been doing it, I've been doing it over a quarter of a century. We've been doing it at the homeschool, high school level, and then I did it at the graduate level at Houston Baptist, so it can go all the way up and down. It's a wonderful exercise for adults. We've talked about that in Eagle Forum. But anyway, you're going to hear as fine a student, if not the finest student I have ever had in Moot Court. And as I said, this is Gavin Sims. He's all of 13 years old. He will introduce himself and he'll go through all of the procedures as a part of his presentation. But we're going to do it real world. So I'm going to have to go back here and because I get to be the judge. That's one of the fun parts about Moot Court. So I'm going to have to change into a judge. And so you may need to stand up. This won't take but about 10 or 12 minutes. And then we'll conclude with that. Okay. Are there any questions though before we, I'm sure not before we go to the yes, sir.
Just one quick one. As you gave this line of tolerance, acceptance, celebration, and elevation, it appears to me, just from watching the news and maybe the last 6 months or so, we are in that celebration stage. Is that the way you see things? Because what we're seeing is more and more people coming out and celebrating same-sex marriage, gay marriage, celebrating now abortion. We're proud of it, publicly proclaiming all that. So, as a society, is what you were meaning by this whole line of progression?
Yeah, exactly, Brian. I think we've gone all the way to elevation though when we start putting it in Congress and things like
Yeah,
that.
we're
That's
probably somewhere between those two in my feeling, but boy, that is scary.
It's very scary. It's very scary. And that in itself should be a motivation also for us as Christians to be busy. Okay, Jennifer's going to go help me and we'll let me go ahead though, before everybody hold it, Jennifer, this is Jennifer Sims, and this is, you've already sort of met Pat Sims, and this is Gavin, who you will be meeting more thoroughly here in just a minute. So we will be back. Don't go away. Please don't go away. You're going to have the fun part now.
You're actually no. Here, I'll get you this chair. Yeah. Yes. Here, wait.
Gavin and I represent the petitioner in this case, Robert B. Casey, the governor of Pennsylvania, in 1992. The issues that gave rise to this case was whether or not the Pennsylvania abortion prohibition law should be overturned, causing this court to revisit Roe v. Wade. This case is crucial in our society today, and it decides whether or not Roe v. Wade would be revisited, which stated that a woman has a constitutional right to an abortion, life is not guaranteed to begin at any given moment, and that man ultimately sets the standard of law, the standard of law being the absolute truth that defines humanity's sense of conscience.
So you're saying, counsel, that this is a humanistic decision that was rendered by the court, that you
Yes,
want to overturn?
Yes, Your Honor. This matter is between the petitioner representing the state of Pennsylvania and Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania over such fundamental issues such as the sanctity of life and the existence of God, over the legal issue of precedent, and the issue of the judicial handling of abortion. This case has previously been heard by this court on April 22nd, 1992. The ruling was that Roe v. Wade should not be revisited, declaring precedent as absolute law. Today we call for the overturning of this ruling, stating that abortions are unconstitutional, that the law should prohibit abortions, and that this court should rehear Roe v. Wade and overturn it accordingly. Our contentions are based on the fact that millions of people are being murdered every year, and that not only this is occurring, but that has been made legal by our nation's governing powers. The decision of Roe v. Wade violates, at the very least, the 14th Amendment and the Declaration of Independence. The rights of the unborn are most obviously upheld through the words of the 14th Amendment, open quote, "Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws," close quote. In Casey v. Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania, it was stated that the unborn are not persons and that this clause does not protect them.
Counsel, do you see any relationship between that then and the evolution cases, for example?
Absolutely, Your Honor.
Could you elaborate a little bit? In relationship to personhood is what I'm asking. Sorry, my question was not clear.
If the unborn are not persons, then they are therefore only animals, because they are not things since they are alive. And so, since they are animals, it is therefore part of the evolutionary theory which states that all people came from animals. In this appeal, we contend that the unborn are equally protected by the law, that the unborn are persons, that they are alive in every possible way, and that the unborn have the right to liberty. Firstly, the unborn are protected by the laws of our country, and the statutes put in place by the concurring opinion are unfounded and illegitimate. They are protected by the Constitution in the form of the 14th Amendment, as stated above and explained throughout this appeal. The provisions of the 14th Amendment give formal legal expression to the philosophical rights expressed in the Declaration of Independence. The Founding Fathers stated in the Declaration of Independence that, open quote, "All men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," close quote. They stated that all people are created. Creation is the making of something out of nothing and involves the influence of a supernatural power. If the Founding Fathers were misled in this belief of a supernatural power, then both the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence are invalid documents and our entire government is void.
So evolutionism actually invalidates both documents?
Yes. If this court makes a decision in favor of evolution, then they are therefore undermining their own power and destroying this court. Additionally, they state that life is a right which is endowed and is unalienable, and that is a right which is impossible to take away. One might make the statement that the Declaration of Independence has no real legitimacy in a court of law. This, however, is false. For without the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution has nothing to stand on. For without the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution is a set of laws for a non-existing country. Additionally, the U.S. Constitution was dated in its 7th article, open quote, "the 17th day of September in the year of our Lord, 1787, and of the independence of the United States of America, the 12th, close quote. This further connects the Declaration to the Constitution with the independence of our nation being referred to in the Constitution.
It's going back to the Declaration period 1775.
Yes, Your Honor. Just as the Declaration of Independence is not the Constitution itself, the foundation of a house is not the house itself, but is vital for the stability and survival of the house. Additionally, precedent, the backbone of Casey versus Planned Parenthood, is completely illogical and leads to corrupted forms of government when it is used flippantly. Precedent, also known as stare decisis, is the principle that a preceding court decision is the trump for all future court decisions on that subject. The 5 concurring judges in Casey asserted that, open quote, "We are satisfied that the immediate question is not the soundness of Roe's resolution of the issue, but the precedential force that must be accorded to its holding."
So the court is saying it really doesn't matter whether the decision might have been right or wrong.
Yes, Your Honor. In American government, there is only one unshakable precedent, and that is the Constitution, and only court decisions rooted in the Constitution have any right to be considered as precedent. But, as stated before, Roe v. Wade is in contradiction with the 14th Amendment, which is a part of the Constitution, and so therefore Roe v. Wade is not a viable precedent and is unconstitutional because it is in contradiction with the Constitution itself.
Counsel, were there cases before Roe directly relevant to abortion that the court could rely on as precedents for Roe?
Absolutely not, Your Honor. In this case, Roe v. Wade was presented as an indisputable precedent, however, and in the concurring opinion of Casey v. Planned Parenthood, it stated that the soundness of Roe was not in question, but it's important as a precedent. This form of precedent contradicts itself in a vast number of ways. For example, if one has the power to make something, one also has the power to tear that thing down. So if this court were to set a precedent, this court could also make that precedent void. The age of a judicial decision does not make it legitimate. Also, precedent does not carry more judicial weight than the Constitution, and the Constitution gives the Supreme Court the most accumulative power in judicial decisions, excluding the Constitution itself. If precedent is the absolute law of our nation, then the 1896 Supreme Court decision of Plessy v. Ferguson still stands today, and segregation is constitutional. If precedent is the absolute law of our country, then the 1857 Supreme Court decision of Dred Scott v. Sanford still stands today, and people of African descent are not citizens of the United States of America, and slavery is constitutional. So if we are saying that precedent is the absolute law of our nation, then the preposterous, ludicrous idea that I could own slaves is constitutionally protected. So in all American law, the unborn are protected, and if the unborn are not protected, then the laws of our nation are not being upheld. Secondly, the unborn, though not visibly the same, are persons. A tadpole, the larval stage of a frog, though not the same as its adult stage in appearance, is a frog through and through. It is just the adolescent form of it. The same can be said of birds and eggs. Embryonic birds, though they are not the same as their parents in knowledge, appearance, skill, or strength, are birds. The same can be said of the unborn. The unborn are not the same as the born in knowledge, appearance, skill, or strength, but they are people just like everyone else. The unborn are also proven as persons by widespread scientific law. Every single person that is alive was inevitably at one point a fetus, and yet people try to convince us that the unborn are not alive and that they are not persons, and they should only continue to exist if we choose for them to. The second law of thermodynamics states in simplified language that things go naturally from order into chaos and not vice versa. So, a baby must start with life and be a person in order to become a viable human being. In other words, Your Honor, if a fetus did not have a mind that thinks, a heart that beats, or a spirit that lives, neither does anyone else. This leads me to my third point. A baby, or as some prefer to call it a fetus, is alive in every last sense of the word. It is proven by science in plain sight that a baby is alive. The 4 scientific criteria for life, according to Exploring Creation with Biology 2nd edition, are as follows. All life forms contain deoxyribonucleic acid, which is called DNA. All life forms have a method by which they extract energy from the surroundings and convert it into energy that sustains them. All life forms can sense changes in their surroundings and respond to those changes, and all life forms reproduce. All of these requirements are obvious enough to understand, except possibly the last one. One might say that a fetus lacks the means by which to reproduce. This, however, is false and is proven by the mule. A mule, a cross between a donkey and a horse, is incapable of producing offspring, and yet it meets the last criterion on the cellular level. This is a case of the unborn, which reproduce rapidly on the cellular level from the moment of his or her conception. Similarly, when using ultrasound imaging, it can be seen with the naked eye that the unborn are moving, growing, and alive. Also, this court found themselves incapable of defining when life begins. As said by the 7 concurring judges in Roe v. Wade, open quote, "We need not resolve the difficult question of when life begins," close quote. This shows the ill-founded beliefs that these justices attempted to use to justify their actions. If this court leaves people the right to choose when life begins using their liberty to take the lives of others. If the courts cannot define when life begins, then I may exercise my right to do so. I may kill any born or unborn person under this one statement by the court. I choose when life begins, so I may choose to kill those that are not alive by my standards.
So, counsel, if you don't like the decision I render, you can choose to kill me.
Your Honor, I firmly believe that that is evil and is wrong, but yes, under this statement by the court, I am legally allowed to do that. And yet, even though not everyone will admit it, there is something in each of us that says that that is wrong. And that is the most solid proof that there is a God that you will ever be able to find. Amen. Abortion is founded on the supposed right of a woman to an abortion because of her health or well-being. But as stated above, since life is defined by the people, I may then lawfully kill anyone who hinders my progression in life. The judges in this case stated abortion as not only a constitutional right, but a fundamental right, placing it above life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, for religion and the God of the Bible are ignored by the courts. This supposedly legitimizes a woman taking the life of her unborn child, for her fundamental right trumps the child's unalienable rights. However, this is paradoxical thinking. If God does not exist, then we have no rights, and we are just animals without rights, much less fundamental rights. This case is not on religion, but this court must recognize, even if the people do not, that if there is no God, we have no rights. Fourthly, the unborn have liberty. The unborn are...
Counsel, in this case, in the Casey decision, did we have a strong majority opinion from the court? 6 justices, 7 justices agreeing with the majority opinion?
There was not. There was only a plurality opinion of 3 judges. There were 5 split opinions over the 9 justices in the Supreme Court.
So that would have to render this one of the weakest decisions ever made in terms of opinions.
Yes, Your Honor. Fourthly, the unborn have liberty. They are persons as argued above, and they are therefore protected by the 14th Amendment. So they have the liberty to choose whether they live or die. Since we cannot ask them, we must assume that they value their lives and want to live. In the concurring opinion, liberty is said to be, open quote, the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. Beliefs about these matters could not define the attributes of personhood were they formed under compulsion of the state, end quote. This is not what liberty is. To exercise liberty is to exercise life, religion, beliefs, speech, arms, and property justly, without harming others or being harmed by others in the exercise of those things. The quote above is defining liberty so that it is compatible with a relative definition of when life begins, as I have stated before. But as I have also stated before, that definition of life allows anyone to take life as he or she so chooses. Which is obviously a violation of the victim's liberty. That is why it is important to specify that the things listed in the correct definition are followed by, open quote, without harming others or being harmed by others in the exercise of those things, close quote.
So, counsel, when the court says it's going to decide this issue and resolve and settle the matter once and for all, inherently it created more chaos rather than eliminating chaos.
Yes, Your Honor. Whenever things are relative and are not absolute, it leaves things open to interpretation, and interpretation leads to chaos, and inevitably it leads to this court having to look at this case again and again and again until they can set down some actual truth or fact of a statement that will be lasting. In summary, Your Honor, we contend that the unborn are protected by American law, and precedent does not defend Roe from reevaluation. That the unborn are in fact persons and are therefore included in the statements of the 14th Amendment. The unborn are indisputably alive, and the unborn have liberty which is being stolen from them along with their lives. For these reasons, we assert that abortion violates American law and is therefore illegal. We therefore pray that this court will assert that abortions are unconstitutional, that the law should prohibit abortions, and that this court should rehear Roe v. Wade and overturn it accordingly. Thank you, Your Honor.
Can we get the judge to rule on that right now?
I gotta think about that. Debate tonight.
Yeah, I guess so.
Would y'all like to ask the Sims or Gavin, or his parents, anything? They've, whether it's genetics or environment. So,
Commend them.
You know, one thing that concerns me is I just heard the statistics that 66% of the 18 to 24-year-olds are dropping out of church. And they give a multitude of reasons, but one of them is that they don't politically agree with the church, you know. Therefore, I think it's one of the reasons that some of the churches are what I call watering down the gospel, but
And to take a quote from my son, that's paradoxical thinking,
Yes.
right? Because in all of us, right, we attest to want to be something greater than ourselves.
that's right.
And when we want and achieve that, there is a standard that needs to be set. We might not always meet that standard, but we don't lower the standard to make ourselves feel good. And I think what you're finding with the youth is that their desire is to be a part of something bigger than themselves, to have that achievement as far as trying to uphold a standard. But whenever we start making everything relative, right, then this unknown of, well, what's right and what's wrong, and the church doesn't say this is the standard, then how is that any different than the world that they're exposed to every day, right? So if the churches would set that standard and say this is the truth, this is what God says, you are going to draw more people to that and say, now I know. And I use the example, we live in West Texas and we had 5 acres, right? And it was all open. And however, in the time that we've been there, we've killed 6 rattlesnakes,
So many.
right? And so our idea, because, trying to make this our home, it was the idea of letting our kids go out and play. However, because we didn't have any boundaries to protect, right, this openness that seems like it's such a great idea, well, there's unknown. Where are the rattlesnakes at, right? We didn't feel comfortable letting our kids go out into that, right? Because there was an unknown. And the kids are the same way. If we don't give them a standard, say you can go this far and no further, you can go this far and no further, and we leave that up. Now, I had cancer. But before I knew that I had cancer and I just knew that I had something in me, the worst part was the unknown, right? But once I knew what it was, boom, we could attack it. And it's the same thing with our children, right? If we don't set those boundaries, set those standards for them, they're walking around in the unknown, right? And so if the church sets that standard, sets those boundaries, hey, there is a God that says in every facet of life, do this, don't do this, right? And if they know that, that's something that they can get behind and move forward and have clarity in their life instead of chaos.
If they don't ever have parental discipline, they'll never have self-discipline.
And to also understand that those rules that God gives us is not to limit us or not to punish us, it's for our protection. And when we can help them understand that God loves us and He wants to protect us from the evils that are going to come from breaking His laws, then I think we can really start to reach and help them grasp what it's really all about.
See what he done? By the way, he didn't know any of the questions I was going to ask. There was no practice to that. college tournaments in Texas, state level tournaments. I've coached state tournaments, winning teams. Worked with graduate students, and that was as fine a presentation as I've heard. And I appreciate it. Thank you for having Blackstone.
Is he homeschooled?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
No other questions or comments? All right, thank you so much, and wait for your information on the, what did I call it?
Webinar.
Yes, the webinar, it's your turn. It's your turn. Yes. All right. Thank you so much.
My wife is, yeah, we go and